My life had never been an easy one. From a fracturing family tearing apart at the seams to living in an absolute hellhole in the middle of absolutely nowhere. I had resigned myself to the fact that life was never going to get any better for me. I had never really had many friends, and I didn't dare assume I would make any either. Homeschooled, sure, that worked out just great for me, I always thought. If by homeschooling my mother meant sit upstairs and occupy yourself while I drink myself into a stupor all day every day, then yeah, my mom was a great fucking teacher. I remember when she caught me with the dregs from one of her many vodka bottles one time. It resulted in a black eye. I was 14. My dad was rarely around, and when he was, it resulted in long, drawn-out screaming matches between him and my mom most evenings, usually over something insignificant. I made myself scarce as much as possible. The last thing I wanted was the fierce accusations being flung haphazardly into my direction. Loathing my existence was the norm. I was completely alone in the world. That was until I met him. At first, Mr. Longface was nothing more than a feeling. It's hard to describe to you, but have you ever felt someone watching you even though you know full well that there's nobody there? Well, it was sort of like that. An emptiness would fill the room like a void for my emotions to pour into. It was, in a way, soothing for me. So when the first time I saw him, it didn't inspire an intense fear most would expect. That particular night, he was peeping at me from the foot of my bed. I'd be lying if I told you I wasn't a bit scared, at least. His dark, ghostly eyes bore into mine as he mouthed at me something I could barely hear. It lasted seconds, but it felt like an eternity. To me anyway. This happened over and over and over until one cold November night, I heard him whispering to me as I slept. "Toby, I feel your pain." I sat up in bed with a start, heart pounding hard in my chest. The hunched, bony figure was yet again at the foot of my bed. "WJ, who are you?" A cracked voice I didn't recognize escaped my mouth. I could only just see the top of his head, long, greasy black strands of hair stuck glistening to his creased brow. The wind howled outside. Rain lashed loudly against the panes of my bedroom window. "I remember when I was your age," he croaked, barely audible. "That was a long time ago, I think." I stared. I didn't want to break my gaze from his, just in case. "Mr. Longface." His voice pierced the silence. He began to rise to his feet. He was a tall man once, I was sure, but now he was hunched and haggard. An outstretched, bony hand thrust towards mine as if he expected me to take it. I continued to stare, tight-lipped at the frail creature before me, not moving a muscle. I heard my mother clattering up the staircase, drunk as always, I presumed. The door flung open and he instantly vanished. "What the fuck are you doing up?" My mom was indeed inebriated, and by the state of her puffed face, I could only assume that she had been crying. I started. Dare I tell the truth? Or would that have landed me another one of her swift right hooks? I decided against it. "The wind's loud, it woke me up," I lied. She eyed me, swaying on her feet slightly, and left the room without another word. I didn't sleep at all that night, the thoughts of Longface whirred around my mind. I debated with myself. Should I be trying to speak with my dad about what I had been experiencing, or would it just become a subject of that night's row with my mom? I decided it wasn't worth the hassle. I'd already determined she wasn't an option for a chit-chat about my worries. So that was that. The withering old man continued to visit with me as the days passed by. He asked ever more probing questions, and the more I appeared to respond, the more frequent his presence became. Eventually, I found myself curled up in bed waiting for him to come, eagerly anticipating what he would have to say next, despite the hairs on the back of my neck standing in warning of what was to come. "Toby, I've been alone for so long. I know that you have too. Speak with me." I had considered spewing all my worries and hateful thoughts with the entity a handful of times, but I hadn't plucked up the courage. However, I had found a peace in his presence recently, and when he was near, my troubles simply seemed to melt away from my soul. And so I began to speak. Longface and I had many lengthy conversations about our lives, our kinship in sadness and fury mostly, but he became something of a comfort to me. Sometimes I wasn't quite sure if I was imagining all of these meetings, but my mood had been rapidly deteriorating for some time, and this made me feel somewhat safe. It was just after Christmas when my dad left. My mom didn't explain why. She didn't have to. I tried to call him a handful of times in secret. It wouldn't make my mom happy if she knew. But before long, I gave up entirely. It rang through to his answering machine every single time I tried, and this only inspired me to relent about his lack of care to Mr. Longface each night. Much to his delight, March rolled around quickly, and I had rarely left my room at all. Not even to sneak to the kitchen for some food as I usually would. I simply sat in the comforting void of Longface's presence or lack thereof. He seemed to leave behind a safe space during the daytime. It gave me peace and respite from the turmoil inside my head. One evening that peace was disturbed, however. "Take the damn phone and speak to your father." My mom pressed the telephone into my hands forcefully and flounced away down the hall, clapping the front door shut behind her. What I clipped, raising the telephone to my ear sharply. I didn't want to speak to this man. He hadn't so much as answered a single one of my calls for months, and I had tried to forget he existed for a short while. He wasn't around much when he lived here, but it was better than the state my mom had gotten herself into now. She frequently left the house to get her drink on, and so I was left even more alone than I was before. "Don't what me, young man?" He sounded irritated, and unsurprisingly, he was slurring. "I've been trying to reach you for a long time. Your mother has said you're stuck in that fucking room of yours all the time." His voice softened slightly. "And you haven't been eating." A bubble of resentment frothed from my mouth. "Yeah, well, you left me. I tried to call you Dad, you never answer. I tried for a long time too. And here you are drunk just like her, trying to be my best friend dash." The line cut dead. I slammed the receiver down carelessly and stormed to my bedroom, tears stinging my eyes. Mr. Longface was waiting for me, perched upon my windowsill, staring sadly out into the night. As I entered the room, a calm trickled over me. He turned to meet my gaze and gestured towards me with an arthritic finger. "You need to get out of this place." "How?" I cried, a lump forming in my throat. There was nowhere to go. I had no family within 300 miles and no friends to call upon. Everything just seemed so pointless. His expression remained unchanged as he spoke the word plainly. "Jump." My brow furrowed. I didn't understand. "Jump," he repeated and slid open my bedroom window. "What?" I breathed, barely able to comprehend what was happening in my own mind. "Together we'll end this suffering and you'll never be alone again. I promise," Mr. Longface whispered. An unusual reassuring smile crept into his expression. "You can be with me. I won't leave you." I edged towards him, but soon found myself clutching tightly to either side of the window frame. Was there really any kind of hope for me unless I was around Mr. Longface? I couldn't see any way out. My mind was whirring. I climbed upon the windowsill, hands trembling as I grasped tightly to pull myself up the frame. I stood there shaking, arms outstretched, barely hanging on. "Your turn," he rattled. Tears stung my eyes once more as the crisp, cold air hit my face. Enough. I didn't care to understand what he meant anymore. Nothing had any meaning. And so, with one last broken sob, I jumped. My eyes were heavy. "Waking from death can feel confusing," Mr. Longface had explained. He had taught me so much. I didn't remember any pain. I can't tell you how it really feels to die. I had tried to revisit the moment I hit the ground, but nothing came forth from the depths of my clouded mind. I could faintly hear my parents shouting at each other. "This is all your fucking fault, Ruth." Even in the event of my death, they couldn't find unity. I fought to open my eyes. More sounds faded in and out of my consciousness. He cut me off. I answered every time he called. God damn it. He just sat there breathing down the phone. I couldn't comprehend or unpick any of these voices until suddenly everything snapped into focus. The first face I saw was that of Mr. Longface. We were back in my bedroom, but it didn't look quite right. His smile had faded and the corners of his mouth had downturned into a sad grimace. It was gloomy. I could faintly make out that the wallpaper was peeling from the walls, and quickly noted that all of my belongings had been stripped from the room. I immediately knew some time had passed from when I had made that bold decision. For him. For us. A faint moan had begun to trail off into silence. Mr. Londash, I started. You are where you put yourself, his voice was breaking with. Was it grief? Resentment? He shuffled painfully towards the doorway of my room, and without turning back to face me, he dissipated into the shadows once more. As time wore on, I resigned myself to the fact that Mr. Longface had simply vanished altogether. Forever. I wandered aimlessly from room to room, day bleeding into day, time transforming into blur of existence. I felt nothing but the hollow, dark emptiness sadness brings. I did call out to Mr. Longface every now and then, hoping to see just a glimpse of his crooked frame, but he never did resurface. All I was left with was the remnants of what he once felt like to me. I suppose even his twisted expression was a comfort in the endless loneliness suffocating me from within. Why had he left me? Where had he gone? Isolation can do a lot to a person. I spent a lot of my time silently sobbing with no concept of what day, time or year it even was anymore. I wanted my life back. He left me, Dad left me. They left me here. My mom and Dad never did return to visit me. Yet again, I was abandoned with nothing but my own fragmented thoughts to keep me company. Sadness slowly entwined with bitter rage, they all fucking left me. Until the day came. The family that had moved into my long unoccupied home slowly came into focus. Sometimes I'd catch a shadow from the corner of my eye. Sometimes a snapshot image flashed before me of their life in the house. Eventually, I could observe them as if I were a mute and unseen member of their family. It took time and a lot of feelings of unfamiliarity with how my home had been transformed. I had spent many years alone wandering the empty rooms of that house, and now I was grasping helplessly at the thought of never being lonely again. Danny was his name. He was about my age when I chose to join Mr. Longface, and as far as I could observe, he was the only child in the family we had so much in common. Once or twice I know he saw me. A confused expression etched across his face just as I had had. Sometimes I'd whisper into his ear when he was asleep. I'd talk to him endlessly about how sad I had been and how empty everything was. Sometimes I'd try to pull his sheets back, just a little bit, and peer from the foot of the bed hoping he'd wake up and speak to me of my woes. It didn't take me long to make real contact with the teen. After all, he had no one else his age to talk to. Not once I'd interfered with his telephone anyway. Took me an awful lot of long nights whispering in his ear, I'll tell you that. One evening he did wake up as I retold my sadness, my abandonment and my loneliness. The boy's saucer eyes showed me a haggard reflection of myself. He was scared and sad and eventually angry, just like me. One time he cried out for me to go away, but I wouldn't leave. He needed me. He was like me, he just didn't know it yet. Danny became my companion, whether he wanted to or not at first. Some nights he'd leave me to complain about the man with the long face to his parents, and that made me lonely and bitterly jealous. They'll all leave you too. Had Mr. Longface returned? I doubted it. Whenever Danny returned to his room to sleep, I would be sure to whisper all of my frustrations into his ear. I think it was weeks, months, years, before he began to speak with me. I had no concept of time at all still then, but I know we built a kind of friendship and no one interrupted us ever again. I'd made sure of that. I had tried so hard to never be left alone, and Danny reminded me so much of myself. Where fear used to tremble in his voice, companionship crept in. And that's when I could feel myself fading away. The longer our interactions were, the more frequently I could speak with him. But I was aging. It felt as if all my energy had been poured into his emptying cup. I needed to hear his sadness. I needed him to join me in my misery. Only we knew true sadness. Danny told me all about his parents' arguments, and he even told me about how lonely he felt living out here, miles away from all other people his age. I understood him. I could ever understand. His cries of sadness made me feel all the isolation slipping away, and I needed him to tell me more. I needed him to be with me. We needed each other. I started to suggest he act out on his sadness so we could be together, properly I mean, and that I was there for him. A couple times he tried to take feeble action, but his parents took him to what they called a shrink. They just wouldn't fucking leave us alone in our room. Thankfully, Danny never wavered in his intentions to be with me, no matter how many times he went to these appointments. No matter how much his bitch of a mother poked her smiling face into his room to check in, together we'd never feel dark, hollow sorrow alone. Long face, he whispered one night. I think I'll come with you for real this time. The shrieking hurt my ears the following morning. His mother had been holding his cold, pale hand for some time when I had managed to gain focus. Danny lay sprawled on his bed, blood-soaked sheets torn from his body. My focus dissolved quickly and shifted again. The room was empty. The house was empty. I was alone, once more swallowed by what was it? Grief? I moaned as a wounded dog for a long time, or so it seemed, until there he was. We'll be together now, right? No one can make us feel alone or sad ever again. Danny was a part of my realm now. His eyes were sunk darkly into their sockets, his skin mottled and pale. I nodded slowly and turned away. Where are you going, Mr. Longface? My time here was at an end. My liver-spotted hands clutched the doorframe as I made to leave. I closed my eyes tightly, my breath rattling in my throat, and uttered, "You're where you put yourself." A feeling of fulfillment finally surged through my broken body as I stepped towards the darkness beyond the threshold of the room. Danny made a long face, just as I had, and just as many others had before me. It was his turn to assume this lonely aging role, and he would find his own companion for a time. Misery does love company, after all.